Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining our Living with Log4j EASM Lessons Learned webinar. My name is Emma Zabayos. I'm a product marketing manager for Cycognito, and I'll be sort of facilitating our talk today. We're really excited to have this discussion about Log4j with you because we've realized that it is a persistent problem that is going to keep bothering security teams, practitioners, and users for, unfortunately, probably quite a long time. I'm joined by today Anne-Marie Zenemoyer, or AMZ, which is our Cycognito CSO and the former security executive of MasterCard, as well as Moritz Lucas, the director of product marketing for Intel 471, a threat intelligence company, and then Phil Wiley, who is our hacker in residence at Cycognito. We're going to hear from them later as we get into the roundtable portion of this webinar. But before we jump in, I would like to set the stage and talk a little bit about where Log4j has started and where we think it is today in terms of have organizations actually made a significant amount of progress in terms of remediating and removing Log4j vulnerabilities from their systems. I wanted to start with this quote because I think it is unfortunately a really sobering it's a sobering look at the Log4j event. Unfortunately, it's not over. This quote from the Cyber Safety Review Board in July talks about how it's really deeply embedded in our systems. Community stakeholders have identified new compromises, new threat actors, and new learnings that emphasize that Log4j, unfortunately, is not going away. We published some original research in August of 2022 that looked at the internal attack surfaces of 36 Global 2000 companies that were Cycognito customers. And what we were hoping to see was that these customers, having been alerted to the existence of Log4j in January 2022, would have made significant progress or perhaps removed it altogether from their systems. Log4j made such a splash in the security community because it was an incredibly dangerous and incredibly prevalent vulnerability across a number of systems. And we found that many companies were exposed due to this vulnerability. Just as a quick reminder of what Log4j is, although I hope you would know if you are coming to this webinar, on December 9th, 2021, Log4j or CVE 2021-44228 was given a 10 out of 10 severity rating because it is a critical issue to any system that uses the Apache Log4j library in the Apache logging project. It's easy to exploit, and there was a public proof of concept that was released almost immediately after the vulnerability was disclosed. Because it was an incredibly critical vulnerability and there was an immediate public proof of concept, we saw a massive cybersecurity response in mitigating the Log4j vulnerability, trying to find as many vulnerabilities as possible, and helping organizations figure out plans for how to deal with Log4j vulnerable assets in their external attack surface. However, our research looking at what was the progress that was made on remediating Log4j since then found that the number of Log4j vulnerable assets is growing, not shrinking. In some cases, when we looked at firms that had Log4j vulnerable assets in December 2021, and then still had them in July of 2022, we found that the number of Log4j vulnerable assets more than doubled. This may not be the exact same vulnerable assets that they had in January, but it shows that a lot of firms aren't making significant progress in remediating the problem. 38% have more assets exposed to Log4j than they did when the vulnerability was discovered. And 62% total just continue to have vulnerable assets. We also saw that 38% did experience a drop in vulnerable assets, and 34% experienced no change, but it means that 70% are still struggling with Log4j. Even after months of hearing over and over again, this is one of the most serious vulnerabilities we've seen in a while. This is a serious issue that could be affecting your company. We're still seeing that some companies just have not been able to get a handle on it or have seen their problem get worse. We also saw that a lot of these remaining vulnerabilities, the issues are being driven by vulnerable web applications. This is particularly concerning because they often contain a lot of sensitive web-facing information that could be very accessible to attackers, like financial information, sensitive PII, or employee information. Previous research that we've worked on in Cycognito also found that one of the reasons why this may be an enduring problem for companies is that attack surfaces are really fluctuate in size very frequently, even as frequently as week to week or month to month. And many companies are unaware of significant portions of their attack surface. We found that some companies are unaware of 10 to 30% of the assets that they have out there, and many of those assets could still have a Log4j vulnerability. Now, having given you all of that context, I'm going to hand it over to our roundtable hosted by Anne-Marie Zennemeyer, AMZ, to talk more about what is the state of things with Log4j right now and what could companies be doing differently to try and combat this ongoing threat.
Thanks, Emma. You know, you did a great job of painting the picture of what happened from a timeline perspective. You know, but I would love to spend just a couple minutes painting the picture from the practitioner view and the research view of what was going on at that time in December. You know, for me, in my roles prior to Cycognito, I was responsible for security for a multi-global organization, you know, that could not fail in a lot of ways. And I know for me, my phone started blowing up in the middle of the night because the world was on fire, and you had this incredible response from the security community. But there was a lot of stuff happening in the background. And I'd like to start off with Moritz over here, and wondering if you could share with us from your perspective what you saw at Intel 471, in the underground, on the dark web. What type of activity did you see that made you know that this was bigger than anything that we had ever seen in a generation?
Thanks, AMZ. Well, actually, the easiest way to describe this is while your phone was lighting up, so was the underground, because most of the actors that we track, especially the mature and sophisticated ones, immediately recognized this for what it was, and that the time to make hay was now. Their understanding is when vulnerabilities of this magnitude hit, there is a window in which you can exploit just about anything you want, but that window is closing because everybody is racing to patch. So there was an immediate interest. Lots of it was focused around, can we get a working exploit? Other actors were working on tools to basically find out how we can scan for vulnerable systems and identify vulnerable systems. And really quickly after that, these pieces came together, and people started exploiting the Log4j vulnerability. A lot of what we see happening there are so-called initial access brokers, people whose job it is to gain initial access to systems. And they work under the assumption that this vulnerability or this hole will only be around for so long. So once they are able to exploit it, they usually use that capability to install a backdoor, which makes the job for defenders, of course, even more difficult, because you come around to patching it, and without knowing it, you are actually already too late. Someone has exploited it and has quietly installed a backdoor and will come back days, weeks, and sometimes months later when they've sold that access onto someone else. I think that was the initial December, January. We saw a lot of that activity, and the tools around this were fairly new and were worth some money in the underground. But what happens after that is that these exploits and this ability to exploit Log4j becomes part of the standard toolkit. So it moves into, we call it commercialization. So commercially available exploit kits will, if you look at any of the popular ones right now and the list of exploits that they have, Log4j is in there. And that means it's available to a lot more actors. It also means that right now, no one is solely focusing on using Log4j anymore, because the expectation is, maybe we'll see in the roundtable unrealistically, that the majority of systems have already been patched, but it's available in the toolkit. And that general availability has also meant that we've seen a wide array of actors actually use it. Everything from, like I said, initial access brokers to ransomware operators and actors launching ransomware attacks to nation state attackers. We've seen observed actors associated with the Iranian kind of nation state use it. Chinese nation state actors have been observed using it. And even the Mirai botnet has been observed using Log4j.
Yeah.
So that's currently where we stand. the upshot of it is right now it's very widely available in the underground. It's one of the keys they'll try. So if you have a system that's still vulnerable, given enough time, someone will come along and exploit it.
So, of course, the irony that those are really great points, Moritz, is that, when we have, just like any 0 day, right, there is a race to exploit. But what was different about this particular vulnerability was the fact that it was so ubiquitous within anything that that used Java. So what was interesting was that you had this piece of open source software, a framework, a library that's used everywhere. So the ability for a victim organization to be under attack was pretty much, not, widespread is an understatement. And being able to find this was extremely difficult. And of course, as you mentioned, there's a race to figure out the exploit. Here, it was publicly available very easily, and not just in the underground, but in public forums. Oops, sorry, I got something in my eye. So I'd love to pivot over to Phil, our hacker in residence over here, who's lived this life. And I'd love for you to give your perspective, Phil, on what you saw. It's good because it wasn't just a race to figure out the exploit, but as Moritz had said, it really was a race from the threat actor to gain access first so that they can then broker it after. It's who has access in many cases to the organization to then resell to victimize that organization. And I think there's a lot of companies that don't necessarily think about that particular tactic within the threat actor tradecraft. So Phil, what did you see from your side in the security community?
Sure. Before I lead into that, you mentioned the threat actors, people not understanding the threat actor. I think sometimes they don't really realize how risky these type of vulnerabilities are. They don't realize how they can be leveraged. And working as a pen tester, having that hacker mindset, you kind of get a better idea of how these things are going to be leveraged. Once you start hacking things, you don't look at the world in the same way. But from a practitioner's perspective, when these things come about, especially Log4j, in our organization, we were, I was at a financial institution at the time, a bank. And one of the tasks that you always get called upon to do within these organizations is anytime these vulnerabilities are released is going out, finding if there's any kind of plugins for vulnerability scanners with these latest type of checks in there. Vendors will typically release one based on just the certain vulnerabilities. So going out, seeing what all is exposed to the internet, seeing if anything's out there is kind of the initial steps, and just kind of monitoring what kind of POCs are being released out there, being pretty heavily involved in the community, and where I get a lot of my information, just watching some of these POCs and seeing what they're able to do, and just kind of helping the defenders, share this information with them, and any information on remediation, as well as bringing, letting them know that there's a lot of software that's affected by this.
And that's a good point. So from my perspective, as one of the folks that led an organization through this time, for those of you that weren't in the room at the time, right? I mean, this webinar has all kinds of folks attending, and as we listen to it, there's going to be people that weren't there during Log4j. But here's the picture, right? You imagine you had all this infrastructure. The world runs on Java, especially financial institutions. It's just everywhere. And you have this little logging library, right? That's easy to use, that's free, it works, and was weaponized. And why we thought a little tiny piece that everybody uses wouldn't be attractive to an attacker that's maintained by a volunteer staff wasn't going to be something that could be used to attack at some point. I mean, we knew that threat model, and here it came. And it came in December at a time, when there's holidays there's school breaks, you had people out of town, there was weather events. We had tornadoes that were happening at a time. I had people on sat phones, all trying to coordinate. There was a serial killer in my neighborhood. Like, this all happened at the same time, right? It's true. So you had this chaos, right? And the reason why it was chaos is because the ease that an attacker could exploit this was so simple. It was just a tiny little text string. And what could be done with that? The remote execution capabilities, taking on servers, taking down infrastructures was a real threat. And it wasn't something that we could just say, oh, we'll just patch within our normal critical 0-day window. No, because we had hundreds of thousands of eyes on this. Good eyes and eyes that would do harm, right? All at the same time. And it was, a race to find it. It was a race to fix it. It was a race to get people on board about how critical this was. I mean, imagine if there was we remember the attacks with the Colonial Pipeline. Remember the attacks with NotPetya, where you had collateral damage in that case, and we had 20% of the shipping capacity of the world impacted to pen and paper for weeks. Imagine if that had happened during that time, and it could have easily, if we hadn't responded so fast to get all hands on deck to try and find it, to try and fix it, and to try and fix it in the most risk responsible way, right? And that meant pulling in teams from engineering, pulling in teams from risk, making sure people knew that this was important, and it was important now in order to overcome the fact that they were traveling and had other things to do. I mean, we at InfoSec, we're used to having, stuff happen on Fridays and on weekends, but the rest of the organization is not when they're in critical response. So there was a lot of lobbying and a lot of influence that had to happen right away to get those engineering and patching teams on board right now with that sense of urgency in order to protect infrastructure. And I don't know about you, Phil and Moritz, but one of the things that I found as a major headwind is that we knew the threat was real right now. And the reality with when you talk to other disciplines in business is that they see things happen and they're able to respond to them. If you're in engineering and you have a bug, the software doesn't work, or if you're in IT and you have downtime, you see that, right? You feel that, and you have to respond immediately, right? You have a certain window SLA. You don't want things to be down. But here we were all working on the big what if, and we better move now because something could happen. And so there was a lot of skepticism. And it also meant that these teams wanted to have a goal line. They wanted to know when they could stop focusing on this because they didn't see anything happen. Now we pivot that, Moritz, to perhaps some of the research that you're familiar with, where attackers will lay within an organization for weeks, months, sometimes years, right? That persistent backdoor that you had mentioned will stay. Just because they have access doesn't mean they're going to use it right away or use it in a way that you can see, right? There's espionage campaigns. They could sell secrets. They could leak data. Not everybody's there to destroy, right? Although obviously we've seen even recent attacks where you have threat actors that'll go in to destroy, embarrass, or do whatever. And so the fact that we weren't seeing things immediately in the press was also a headwind for us. We saw some, right? But I think there's a lot of folks outside of security that don't realize that notification laws don't necessarily require you to disclose and for you to disclose immediately unless you're sure you've been breached, right? And so we had to also kind of educate our partners here, and sometimes even folks within security, that this is going to be a long haul, because the average attacker can stay in for years, for months, for days. And this is one of the reasons why I think it was so important that the security community came together to provide intel for each other. So Phil, I'm going to come to you next. And Moritz, feel free to chime in here as well, with the things that you guys saw on the underground. And how did you address this notion of, sometimes security can be viewed as like Chicken Little, and you're telling me the earth's on fire, the internet's on fire, but I'm not seeing anybody blow up. How did you see the security community, Phil, react on Twitter and all of these types of things? And Moritz, how did you see things from your perspective with the research that Intel 471 does?
So for like the community, people posting exploit POCs, proof of concepts out there, video walkthroughs on how people had built labs. And, some of this is just individual researchers as well as some research organizations. So I think that was a good way to show, because sometimes people really don't realize the severity of an issue until they can see how easily exploited it is. So that was some of the things that I saw out in the security community. People, a lot of major organizations that did security research had some kind of video, and some training organizations had like a lab environment to be able to demonstrate those type of exploits.
So I think from our perspective, I think thankfully a lot of our clients realized the severity right away, and I think in part that's actually due to the fact that if you kind of track this research, you become very aware of how the underground works, and that this is exactly the type of thing that they jump on. And indeed, how the whole initial access broker model works, that someone may just gain access and then quietly keep that, not because they have anything in mind, because they're in the business of selling access. And funnily enough, that doesn't happen instantaneous. I think we've done some research that actually points out that on average, it takes about 77 days or more to sell an access. Some go within the week, some take months before they find someone who's willing to pay them for this access. So there was this realization that they really understood how that worked. The interesting part about Log4j, from our perspective, was that it's basically looking outside, looking into the defenders. It was harder to identify which systems were vulnerable, because actually the logging library you can't see it from outside. It may be embedded in an application which is actually using Log4j, which also makes it interesting, because of course, where is Log4j actually running? It may be running further back in the network, and you can actually make a web app log something way back further in the network and actually execute your code there. So as a vulnerability, it had some really lovely tricks up its sleeve. In 2021, just before Log4j broke, we actually had two of them, because in March we had, I think it was 4 vulnerabilities in Exchange come up, which were also remotely exploitable. And RCE vulnerabilities, unauthenticated remote code execution, are the underground's dream. That's the easiest one to go after. That's absolutely lovely. So jump on it and make hay while the sun shines is the motto in those cases. I think from a defender perspective, that one was slightly easier to defend against, because you basically probably know where Exchange servers are. But identifying where you have Log4j running in the myriad of applications, web apps, and internet-facing stuff within the organization is slightly more challenging, I would imagine. So thankfully, from a lot of our clients immediately realized this and jumped on it.
So we have a great question in the chat, in the Q&A chat from Susan Richards. Oh, it just went away. So well, I'll try to remember from what I saw.
No, it's under answered. I can read it out for you. I'll do the honors. If 70% of organizations still have this vulnerability, and it was critical risk in December, what is the concern now that bad actors have had 10 months to exploit? Did fixing in the early days help mitigate anything, or is the threat still critical?
So I think the answer to that is, a couple of parts. right? The criticality of the vulnerability doesn't change. If it's present in your system, you're still subject to that vulnerability. And since there is a very mature and reliable exploit, a very mature and reliable way to take advantage of that vulnerability, if it exists in your system, then there's a problem, right? That is a very large risk that an organization is taking by failing to remediate that. So it is still a very big deal, because you can still compromise and take down an entire server with this tiny little text string. It still exists. And if anything, what's happened over the past 10 months is that maturity of the exploit and the ability to enumerate within the system what you can do with that exploit has only gotten stronger, right? So as organizations, remember I mentioned that, when we're working with engineering, they're used to ones and zeros. We go in for a fix, it's done, I go back to my life, right? There's an emergency fix, I fix it, I'm done, I go back to my life. And so they were waiting for when that goalpost is going to be hit, when they were done and they can go focus on other things instead of this all hands on deck. And what happened was this attack surface continues to grow because the hygiene of our systems is never really where it needs to be. We have mergers and acquisitions, we have third-party builds. The attack surface of what's connected to an organization will grow and shrink over time, right? Because we still have developers downloading this library. I think one of the pieces of research that came out even in the early days is that when they surveyed a bunch of developers, and please don't quote me on the number here, as far as how many, I think it was a little over 1,200, the majority of them admitted that they were still downloading this stuff because it wasn't, they weren't in the mix, right? So when organizations passed January and February, and they asked for all of this rigor to be patched for what they knew, started to go back to normal cadence, the eye was taken off the attack surface, right? The eye was taken off the urgency. And this is a regular thing that happens with any type of incident. It's a human behavior, right? Like you get fatigue. So if you don't have, a task force, a tool, or something that's keeping an eye on this, it's easy to disassociate from the risk. And then 6 months later, you ask the question again, and you see that where you were in January with maybe your 50 or 60% or 70% buttoned up, now the attack surface has grown and Log4j is back with a vengeance again, right? And you've been operating this whole time with a bunch of holes. So I think it's still absolutely a critical threat. And it's one of the reasons why, when we have an incident, and in this case, it's a near incident for many, and maybe it's an incident that people don't know about yet because of that. Remember that length of time attackers can live before they reveal themselves. That if you're not watching that hygiene and doing these regular assessments, you could be living with more risk than your business has appetite for, and that's not good for any aspect for longevity or any aspect for risk. I see that we're out of time here. Emma, is there anything else that you want to bring into the mix, or Moritz or Phil?
I wanted to give, well, first of all, thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you for sharing so much wisdom. And I want to give Moritz an opportunity to talk about Intel 471 and their latest cyber threat report, if you want to take a few moments for that, Moritz.
Of course, I'd be happy to. Yes, I think most of this webinar, as the title implied, focused on Log4j. And yes, as AMZ said, Log4j isn't going to go away. It isn't going to be less severe. And as the title aptly said, we're just going to have to live with it. It's become commoditized. It's part of the toolkit that attackers can use, but it's certainly not the only vulnerability. It's not the only thing they do. And if you'd like to know more about what attackers are up to, then there's more information, and I'm sure Log4j is mentioned as well in our latest cyber threat report, which actually also contains trends and predictions for 2023. So you're more than welcome. I've tried to, it's quite a long URL, but if you go to our website, www.intel471.com, it's quite easy to find from there, but you can also note down the full URL and request your copy.
Thank you so much, Moritz, and thank you for taking the time to share your wisdom with us today. Again, thank you to all of our panelists and to everyone who contributed to this research. And we would just like to say thank you all so much for attending. We were so happy to have you, and if you have any questions, if you're interested in learning more about either Intel 471 or Cycognito, please contact us and let us know. We would love to talk more about it. Thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of the day.
Thanks, Emma.